In 1877, a man emerged from the heart of Africa after a journey so brutal that only half his expedition survived. The Western world hailed him as the greatest explorer of his generation. Newspapers called him a hero. Kings and presidents wanted to meet him. But this man would return to Africa not as an explorer, but as something far more sinister. He would become the architect of one of history's greatest atrocities, a crime so massive that it would claim an estimated 10 million lives. This is the story of Henry Morton Stanley, the man who sold the Congo. The Congo Free State. You might have heard of it as one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history. But here's what most people don't know. It wasn't created by an army. It wasn't conquered in a traditional war. It was secured by one man, a journalist turned explorer who convinced African chiefs to sign away their land, their people, and their future with nothing but words, trinkets, and deception. That man was Henry Morton Stanley. And while history remembers King Leopold II of Belgium as the villain of this story, it was Stanley who made it all possible. He was the salesman, the negotiator, the face of what Leopold called civilization. Today, we're diving deep into how Stanley went from celebrated explorer to colonial mercenary, and how his actions in the Congo would lead to one of the darkest chapters in human history. First, let's talk about who Henry Morton Stanley really was, because even his name was a lie. He was born John Rowlands in 1841 in Wales. His childhood was brutal. His father died before he was born. His mother abandoned him, and he spent years in a workhouse where he was abused and beaten. At 15, he fled to America as a cabin boy on a merchant ship. In New Orleans, he was taken in by a wealthy merchant named Henry Stanley, whose name he adopted. But even this heartwarming detail is disputed. Some historians believe Stanley invented the entire story. What we do know is that John Rowlands ceased to exist, and Henry Morton Stanley was born. Stanley fought on both sides of the American Civil War, first for the Confederacy, then, after being captured, for the Union. After the war, he reinvented himself again, this time as a journalist. In 1869, the New York Herald sent him on the assignment that would make him famous. Find Dr. David Livingstone, the missionary explorer who had gone missing in Africa. In 1871, Stanley found Livingstone near Lake Tanganyika and supposedly greeted him with the now famous line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" The moment made Stanley an international celebrity. But here's where the darkness begins to show. Even during his search for Livingstone, Stanley's methods were brutal. He routinely whipped his African porters, abandoned the sick, and shot those he considered deserters. His own men called him Beulah Matari, the breaker of rocks, not out of respect, but out of fear. In 1874, Stanley embarked on his most ambitious expedition, to cross Africa from east to west, following the Congo River to its mouth. The journey took 999 days. Of the 356 people who started, only 114 survived. Stanley lost 3 European companions and killed countless Africans along the way, sometimes in battles, sometimes in cold blood. But when he emerged in 1877, the Western world didn't care about the body count. They only cared that he had mapped the Congo River, one of the last great mysteries of the African continent. Stanley had proven something valuable, that the Congo was accessible, that it could be exploited. And one man was paying very close attention: King Leopold II of Belgium. King Leopold II of Belgium was obsessed with colonies. He looked at Britain, France, and the Netherlands with envy as they carved up the world and grew rich from colonial exploitation. But Belgium was small, and Leopold had no colonial empire of his own. He had tried to buy colonies. He had tried to lease them. He'd looked at territories in South America, Asia, and the Pacific. Nothing worked. Then Stanley published his account of the Congo journey, describing a river system that could transport goods from the interior of Africa to the coast. He described fertile land, untapped resources, and primitive tribes that could be civilized. Leopold saw his chance. In 1878, Leopold invited Stanley to Brussels. He didn't present himself as a greedy king looking to exploit Africa. No, Leopold was a master manipulator. He spoke of bringing civilization to Africa, of ending the Arab slave trade, of building railways and schools. He created an organization called the International African Association, which he claimed was a scientific and philanthropic endeavor. The name was deliberately vague and noble-sounding. In reality, it was Leopold's personal corporation, designed to claim African territory for himself. Leopold made Stanley an offer: return to the Congo, but not as an explorer. This time, Stanley would be a colonial agent. His mission was to establish a chain of stations along the Congo River, sign treaties with local chiefs, and claim the territory for Leopold's organization. Stanley would be paid handsomely, far more than any newspaper could offer, and he would have virtually unlimited authority to do whatever was necessary to secure the Congo. Stanley accepted. In 1879, he returned to the Congo, but this time with a very different purpose. He wasn't there to explore. He wasn't there to map. He was there to conquer, not with armies, but with contracts. Stanley's strategy was simple but devastatingly effective. He would approach African chiefs and convince them to sign treaties that supposedly established friendship and trade relationships. In exchange for cloth, beads, brass rods, and cheap manufactured goods, the chiefs would mark an X on documents they couldn't read. But these treaties didn't say what Stanley told the chiefs they said. The treaties actually stated that the chiefs were surrendering sovereignty over their land. They were giving Leopold's organization exclusive commercial rights. They were agreeing that their people could be forced to work. They were, in essence, selling their entire territories and populations into servitude. Over 5 years, Stanley negotiated over 400 of these treaties. He traveled up and down the Congo River, establishing stations that would become centers of control and exploitation. He built roads. He hired soldiers. He created the infrastructure of colonialism. And he did it all under the banner of civilization and progress. Meanwhile, Leopold was playing a larger game in Europe. In 1884 to 85, European powers met at the Berlin Conference to carve up Africa amongst themselves. This is where the scramble for Africa was formalized. European nations literally drew lines on maps to divide up an entire continent, without a single African representative in the room. Leopold presented himself as a humanitarian. He argued that his International African Association was different from other colonial powers, that it existed only to bring civilization and end slavery. His representatives promised that the Congo would be a free trade zone, open to all nations. It was all lies, but it worked. The European powers recognized Leopold's claim to the Congo. In 1885, the Congo Free State was officially created, not as a Belgian colony, but as Leopold's personal property. An area 76 times the size of Belgium, with millions of people, now belonged to one man, and Stanley had delivered it to him. Stanley left the Congo in 1884, but the system he created would soon reveal its true nature. Leopold had found his cash crop, rubber. The invention of the pneumatic tire and the rise of the automobile created an enormous global demand for rubber, and the Congo had rubber vines everywhere. Leopold's agents turned the Congo into a slave state. Congolese men were forced to collect rubber quotas under threat of death. If they failed to meet their quotas, soldiers would burn their villages. Women and children were held hostage to force men to work. And then there were the hands. To prove they weren't wasting bullets, soldiers had to present severed hands for every shot fired. This led to baskets of severed hands, hands of men, women, and children, being presented as proof of discipline. Villages that resisted were massacred. Entire regions were depopulated. Starvation and disease killed millions more. Historians estimate that between 1885 and 1908, the population of the Congo was cut in half. That's approximately 10 million people dead, one of the largest genocides in human history. And what about Stanley? He knew what was happening, even as evidence mounted. Even as journalists and missionaries began documenting the atrocities, Stanley defended Leopold. He called the reports exaggerations. He insisted that civilization had come to Africa. It took people like Edmund Morel, a British shipping clerk turned journalist, and Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat, to expose the truth. Their reports shocked the world. The first international human rights movement was born from the Congo Reform Association's efforts to end Leopold's reign of terror. In 1908, facing international pressure, Leopold was finally forced to hand over the Congo to the Belgian government. He had made an enormous fortune, equivalent to billions in today's money, from Congolese rubber and ivory. He never faced justice. He died wealthy and respected in 1909. Stanley died in 1904, before Leopold lost control of the Congo. He was buried with honors in England. His funeral was attended by dignitaries. Obituaries praise him as one of the greatest explorers in history. For decades, he was remembered as a hero. Statues were erected in his honor. Schools were named after him. His books were bestsellers. But his real legacy is written in the Congo itself. The extraction economy he helped establish, the authoritarian structures he built, the tribal divisions he exploited. These patterns continued long after independence. The Congo has some of the world's richest mineral deposits, yet most Congolese live in poverty. The country has been ravaged by wars, fueled by competition over resources. Millions have died in conflicts that trace their roots back to colonial exploitation. In recent years, Stanley statues have been removed. His legacy is being re-examined. We're finally starting to tell the truth about who he was and what he did. But we must also remember that the Congolese were never passive victims. They resisted. They fought back. They survived. And they continue to fight for justice and dignity today. So why does Stanley's story matter today? Because it reveals something uncomfortable about how history is written. For over a century, Stanley was celebrated as an explorer and adventurer. His brutality was downplayed or ignored. The people he harmed were written out of the story. His story reminds us that colonialism wasn't just about armies and conquest. It was about lies. It was about legal manipulation. It was about men in suits signing papers that condemned millions to suffering. Stanley showed that you don't need weapons to conquer a continent. You just need contracts that people can't read and a willingness to call exploitation civilization. The Congo has never fully recovered from what Stanley and Leopold unleashed. The systems of extraction and exploitation they created evolved but never truly ended. Understanding this history is essential to understanding the Congo's present. Stanley sold the Congo with handshakes and treaties. He delivered millions of people into one of history's worst genocides. And for most of his life, he was praised for it. In his own journals, Stanley once wrote, "The savage only respects force, power, boldness, and decision." But perhaps the real savagery was his. The savagery of a man who could look at human beings and see only resources to be exploited. History called him an explorer, but the Congolese knew the truth. They called him the breaker of rocks, the destroyer, the man who sold the Congo. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about this history, I've listed some excellent books and documentaries in the description below. Consider supporting organizations working in the Congo today to address the ongoing effects of this colonial legacy. Hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into history's uncomfortable truths, and let me know in the comments, what other historical figures do you think deserve to have their legacies re-examined? See you in the next one.